Welcome back to Boom and Bust. We're having a discussion with Michael Geist. He is professor of law at the University of Ottawa. Michael, just talking about the reaction to the Online News Act. It looks like Meta is now signaling, that's Facebook, Instagram, etc., now signaling that they are getting out of news worldwide, so that there's really no possibility of getting payment for links anymore. Is that your analysis of the situation, first of all?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think they're doing more than signaling. I think they're actually increasingly extricating themselves from the news sector. They've been downgrading, in a sense, or downplaying the amount of news that people see in their feeds. For some time, they were saying, listen, it's about 3% of users' feeds, and that's a significant decline over time. They've said that that kind of content is highly substitutable, which I think helps explain why they've made the move they have. In other words, people spend the same amount of time on the platform, whether they're looking at news links or pictures of friends. And from the perspective of a company like Facebook, the whole goal is to keep people on the platform and engaged. And viewed through that prism, news content is actually not good content. It's content that actually, if you click on the link, sends you away from the platform. They'd much rather that you spent time looking at pictures of friends. And so given that people seem happier, they say, based on some of their metrics, with news removed, we're starting to see more and more around the world this kind of movement. And in some ways, Canada's leading the way, and it appears that the way they will adopt this is if countries say, listen, there is a payment required for those links, they will simply say, well, we're just going to stop linking altogether.
But that user experience seems to be, as you say, upgraded by not getting deluged with the doom scrolling that happens on social media these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think both the government and, frankly, the media lobby groups that lobbied very heavily for this legislation were of the view that they could really just force these companies into this, that they simply could not live without news on their platform, could not live without Canadian news on their platform. And so given the choice between either forcing them to carry the content or forcing them to pay for the content, they said, let's force them to pay for the content because they'll have no choice but to carry it. What we've learned is, in fact, it was a bad bet. That the companies said consistently that if forced to pay, they would stop carrying it. That's precisely what's happened. And I think increasingly we see that there is an acceptance that's where we're at. And as you hinted at earlier, it seems to me that this legislation is a failure, full stop right now, that you can't make up the lost traffic, the lost revenue from the deals that have been now canceled with one of the major platforms out. Even though the government, it does seem, is trying, because in effect, what they've tried to say is that they want the other big company implicated by this legislation, Google, to make up the difference, to pay even more than what was initially projected. And it sure feels like they're doing that in part because they know the Meta money is lost. Let's get Google to kick in even more so this comes out whole.
I didn't even know that last part. So is that the government's next move on this then?
Well, they're not saying that that's what they've done, but if you take a look at their estimates for what the minimum threshold that Google would be required to pay, it's more than 50% higher than it was less than a year ago when they appeared before committee on this bill. As it turns out, the number that Google would pay is very close to the number that they told the committee a year ago, or less than a year ago, this bill would generate. And so it sure feels like as they increase by more than 50% the projections, one of the things that they're doing is basically saying, if Google pays more, that kind of makes up for some of the lost revenue that we'd otherwise had from Meta. But of course, Google looks at this and said, the bill is now 50% higher than it once was. You're establishing an unprecedented minimum floor of expenditures, something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world and is not at all correlated to actual costs of news production. And there is a serious risk, and I think the harm would be in many ways almost catastrophic for the industry, that Google may also walk away.
Is that more, I'm just curious, is that technically more difficult for Google than Meta, or is it the same process to walk away?
I don't think there's much of a technical difference, but the implications, I think, are a lot bigger. If we're talking on the one hand about a social media company where people are sharing news links, obviously there's an impact. There's a loss of traffic to the underlying sites. We've had some sites, news sites, especially newer ones, say that it could be as much as 50% of their traffic as they try to build community coming from social media, and that's lost. But in the case of Google, you're talking not just about sort of hot news, the news of the day, but if all those links from the index are gone, then a lot of historical searchers, people looking for information, about events that took place last week, last month, last year, 10 years ago. Many of those may be lost as well. And so there's a big impact for individual Canadians conducting research, and big impact certainly for the media companies who, to a more significant extent, rely on search for much of their traffic.
Incredible. Michael Geist will return after we have a brief commercial break. Please stay with us.